Hello everyone, for my article summary I read The Queering of ESL Language and Pedagogies and Materials by Joshua Pays. I felt to properly summarize this article we should start by defining key terms and key concepts. The first key term I'd like to discuss is gay-friendly pedagogies, which allows students to use their sexual identities in speech acts and communicate between LGBT individuals. Another key term is heteronormity, which most of us are familiar with, but it means language is set strictly in the concept of only men and women being in relationships. Another key term is sexualities and their social cultural relevance, which is how sexuality plays into identity and what it means in the broader scope of society. And another key concept I'd like to discuss is introduction of LGBT discourse into classrooms, as the current norm is strictly heteronormative and many people have no reference to inform LGBT discourse other than personal experience. And finally, queer classroom materials, which is materials designed in such a way to be inclusive, as opposed to current materials which are either non-existent for queer individuals or portray or perpetuate negative stereotypes. Now let's talk about what the approach of the article was. So was the article about a particular population, or was it a theoretical approach? This article is, in my opinion, a theoretical approach. The focus was creating teaching materials. While the article does discuss teaching in a more inclusive manner and does make reference to a particular population, the article is about making relevant materials for queer students, and the article focuses very little on the people themselves. The article does, however, put great focus on taking steps to make the classroom and materials inclusive for queer students, as the article is not talking about a people in particular, not a person, but rather a group and what you can do for them. I would say the article is about the theory and not the people. The approach of the article is to address what it means to be queer and the classroom and how to achieve this. Now that we established the approach, let's discuss the content of the article. I feel it's imperative to understand that queer is an identity, and as an identity it should be considered and taken into account what aspects of the learning environment this affects. What Pays is explaining in the article is the traditional learning material have not taken into account the queer identity. Sometimes if queer identity is taken into account, it's from a biased perspective, which plays upon stereotypes or highlights misconceptions that paint the queer community in a negative light. However, this is not only the teaching materials, but the teachers themselves. So a lot of the lessons are written from a heteronormative perspective, and the teachers are not taking into consideration, and this creates a waterfall effect that leaves everything downstream of the teacher to be viewed in a heteronormative perspective. From the lesson plans to the role plays and even assessment, the article then goes on to explain what is being done at the university level at the moment, not enough, or some ham-fisted attempt to force it in. Rather than sexualize the classroom and imply that students should cheer for anything not heterosexual or decide to chide it, the article explains that the sourcing of classroom materials should be cautious and deliberate without forcing a reception to the sexuality aspect of it. To better explain this, I would say the correct way to clear a classroom is to introduce source material. The source material should be not about someone being queer, but rather about a human who happens to be queer. So now that we have this information, what can we do with it? I think it should be noted that students should have access to learning materials which reflect their identity. If a language is an aspect of identity in the same way sexuality is an aspect of identity, you would not require an English learner to do a French lesson in your English classroom. So the course materials should really reflect all learners. This does not have to be extreme or to the point where someone might be offended. This could be as simple as changing single words, like changing girlfriend to girlfriend/boyfriend, or better yet, partner. This does not need to be a drastic change, but it should be meaningful and inclusive change. is not about forcing anyone to do anything. This would mean that changes should be organic and open to interpretation to allow inclusion, and currently there are a whole host of students that are not reflected in the current material. Materials are the most important aspect, in my opinion, as for many years of education, I only recall seeing a single representation of a queer person in my Japanese 2 textbook. It is safe to say that the material is not represented in the slightest. There should also be a focus on selecting good materials. It should not be a negative representation, nor should it be some campy John Waters depiction of a queer individual. There's also an issue of focus. If there's a text about a person in relation to their sexuality, the focus should remain on the person. As a person, it should never be about the person being queer, but rather about a person who is queer. The best way to achieve this is to source information locally and review it carefully, ensuring that your own bias is not showing. The strongest argument that can be made for changing the classroom and queering the classroom is because the materials we currently have are not reflective of the world we live in. I would say this relates well to Chapter 8 in Ishihara and Cohen. They write, textbook dialogues many times sound awkward or stilted. Such dialogues are inauthentic in the sense that they do not represent spontaneous pragmatic language as used in natural conversation. This statement can be applied to dialogue, which the goal is to make it sound as authentic as possible. In order to have authentic dialogue and learn L2 pragmatics, the material should be as realistic as possible. An authentic dialogue is one that represents society as a whole, as closely as possible, which would include dialogue that includes the queer community, vice ignoring it or enforcing heteronormative dialogue. Well, thank you, and I hope you found this informative.